And that is an unbelievably important technical and engineering feat. One of the problems was, if you look at this again, I said that San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco were sort of set up as radials. There was no grid across the state of California. It was extremely difficult, with a lot of roadblocks, to get power from San Francisco to Los Angeles. In fact, there was only one road, one transmission line that could handle it. It was almost as difficult to get power from Eastern California to Western California in San Diego. Again, just wasn't, the transmission hadn't been constructed to handle that problem. Deregulation had been started in New England and New York and the north central states, northeast states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and there it worked very well because they truly did have a grid that crisscrossed everywhere. But getting power from one place to another was very, very difficult. Why was that important? Well, in electric power, recognize that supply has to equal demand. If supply of power is less than the demand for power, they don't keep it plugged in, but for more than 5%, for more than a half hour, what happens? The whole system will burn up. If supply exceeds demand by more than 3, 4, 5% for an extended period of time, the whole system burns up. So the ISO's job was to manage that transmission to keep the system stable and operating so that the power that was produced by these independent companies now reached the consumer that wanted it. Another attribute of power, you can't store it. Yeah, there's a little bit way where you can store power in reservoirs. You can do what they call pump storage. You can pump water uphill at night and let it run through a generator during the day. But that provides you very, very little net effective storage. So you need power, you have to generate it on a simultaneous basis. So that becomes key. Nobody has yet come up with a battery that'll handle that situation either. So you've got a situation where supply must equal demand, there is no net storage. That makes reserve power absolutely essential. So if your plan is I want to deliver 100 megawatts of power, and you've got 100 megawatts of power running to deliver it, you're legally required, and the ISO is going to make darn sure that you have at least 7 and preferably 10 to 12% backup. So if you've got a plant that can generate 150 megawatts, you're not going to be able to deliver 150 megawatts. They want that plant running at 110, 115. So you've got reserve power. So everybody that's got these plans, they can't run them full speed. They've got to have that reserve power. Why? Because if a customer goes offline, a big manufacturing plant, all of a sudden supply exceeds demand. Somebody's got to shut down. You've got to have that. Or if a plant, more likely, if a plant goes down, somebody has to be able to deliver additional power. And you've only got minutes to do it. That reserve becomes absolutely key to maintaining the integrity of your transmission system. So your supply must equal demand. You can't store the power. And you need to have backup power for your plants. In California, we're getting into solar and wind, just like we are here in Texas. And unfortunately, solar and wind require even more backup power than gas plants. Because while the gas plant might have a problem, heck, the sun can go behind a cloud and all your solar power can disappear. Wind can go from 20 miles an hour to 0 in 10 seconds, and all your wind power can disappear. If that disappears, in order to maintain supply equal demand, you've got to have other plants, typically natural gas plants, that can go from 50 megawatts an hour to 70 megawatts an hour inside of 2 or 3 minutes. That became key to maintaining a balanced system. Cal ISO, deregulation started successfully on April 1st, 1998. I got there a year later, June of 1999, and everything was going just hunky-dory. We had great rapport with the state. Everything was going very well. In early 2000, San Diego, which had minimal nuclear exposure and had been very successful in selling off their plants, maybe it was even late 1999, paid off all its sunk costs, and they were allowed to let their prices go free. The price caps, the frozen prices at San Diego Gas and Electric were lifted, and their prices moved with the market. Customers loved it because their prices went down. They thought it was great. And then we got towards early summer, late spring, early summer of 2000. And guess what happened? What's the highest temperature anybody here ever remembers in San Francisco? You know what it got to in San Francisco in June of 2000? Where, air conditioning is opening your window? 106. The Silicon Valley got even hotter. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention that because with deregulation impending, do you know how many new electric plants were built in California between 1988 and 1998? Zero. So we've got an aging power fleet. We've got heat in the south, in the north, heat in the south, a company called El Paso Energy, headquartered in Houston, which was the only pipeline going in from Texas to California, had all sorts of problems with their plants, their pipeline delivering natural gas. And all of a sudden we had prices for power started going sky high. Well, the politicians started getting real upset. Because remember I told you San Diego had let their prices float? Prices in June of 2000 in San Diego increased by 40%. July and August at times they got as high as 2 to 3 times what they had been before. 200 to 300%. People were screaming. So they scream at the politicians, put this deregulation in. What are you going to do? You've got to do something. Well, they tried to fix the rate, but that the law was free. I mean, the law couldn't be fixed. It was floating, and that's the way it was. At that point in time, nobody realized that while San Diego's rates had gone sky high, their customers were paying the bills. The cost of electricity for SoCal Edison and for Pacific Gas and Electric also went sky high. But they still had fixed rates. And by the time we got to September and October 2000, they were almost bankrupt. Because they were buying the power, same power that San Diego was, but they couldn't charge for it. There were bigger companies in San Diego, but they were just about done in. Meanwhile, there's a point I missed. The California ISO, we had the California PX was buying and selling, clearing the power on the day before and day of. The Cal ISO, in order to make sure that supply always equaled demand, had the ability to buy power or sell power in the hour of. And we would buy and sell power so that we could always keep supply equal to demand. Again, we did it as agents. And it was always expected that we would buy 2 or 3% of the power, and that was about it. Well, with all the uncertainty that was going on, and the Cal PX, nobody wanted to sell a day ahead, because nobody knew what the price was going to be. Nobody wanted to sell the day of. And the IOUs all went to their regulators and said, can't we sign long-term power contracts? No. this is just an aberration, it'll clear. If you sign a long-term power contract now, you'll pay too much and it'll look bad. So they wouldn't let them do it. Prices stayed up. Supply went down. People started missing their payments. And those that had been buying on the Cal PX started buying, instead of 3% of the power being cleared at the Cal ISO, nobody would commit to power until real time. And the 3% we cleared in January of 2000, 3% of the market, increased to 40% of the market in January of 2001, 1 year later. And the price increased by an equal significant factor. As a matter of fact, in January of 2000, we cleared $100 million of power in order to keep that 3% supply equal demand. In January of 2001, we cleared $1.6 million of power. Because nobody, either the generators or the utility companies, would supply power except on a real-time basis. So they knew the price, they knew who was buying, and they could do it. In December of 2000, we got the bills, the payment for the bills that we sent out in October, for the October power. And we sent out probably $150 million in bills, and we wound up collecting 75 cents on the dollar. All of a sudden, well, if we collected 75%, we couldn't pay all the bills. Fortunately for the Cal ISO, we had a first call on the money we collected to pay our expenses. And remember I said we were functioning as agents, not as principals. So we passed through what we got, and everybody who supplied power in the Cal market in October, when they got paid in December, got 50 to 75 cents on the dollar. Well, we got to January, and nobody wanted to sell. By the way, January 2001, some guy named Bush was coming in as president, Clinton was leaving, Washington was totally distracted, and it got pretty messy. Further in California, it got really messy. Our governance was a stakeholder board. We had 24 appointed board members who were there to oversee us. They represented the IOUs, they represented the state, they represented consumer groups, and for the first 2 years I was there, they worked together because the Cal ISO was a not-for-profit public benefit corporation dedicated to helping the people. And our board worked tremendously, together tremendously. In November, I remember a motion that we took to the board, a resolution that we would fix the price at $250, but we would allow variations to that when justified by the generators. Basically saying we could buy power for more, because we needed then. And the board tied 12-12. And four members abstained. And every one of the 24 who voted in the interest of the unit they represented, not in the interest of the people of California. On Saturday, December 8th, 2000, the officers of the Cal ISO convened and spent all day. We pulled together a change in our tariff, our rules of regulation. We were actually regulated by the FERC. We didn't take it to our board. We took it to the FERC. They approved it in 24 hours. When we violated all sorts of law by not taking it to our board. The FERC violated all sorts of precedent by approving it in 24 hours, when it normally took them 24 days. But basically, they gave us the power to set prices, to buy the power we needed to keep the lights on. The governor went bananas. He fired, the whole board was fired. The legislature actually fired him. They said, we'll replace you with 5 appointed by the governor. The FERC looked at it and said, you're no longer independent, we're not going to certify that to the board, and the whole thing, it looks really, really bad. Meanwhile, nobody's paying their bills, nobody wants to generate power, and they're not getting paid. We had a process that when our reserves dropped below 7%, we called what was called a stage 3. We then looked for contracts that were negotiable or could be reduced, and certain contracts provided for that. We reduced that power. We look for good citizens who reduce the power. You walk into a grocery store and find half their lights out. They would be supporting those efforts. When power got to 5%, or backup got to 5%, we'd be that much more strong. We call stage 2, and we strongly encourage people. When we got to 3%, we called it stage 3, and we had the ability to black out. And we did. We wound up not having enough power supply. It was in January of 2001 that we wound up having rotating blackouts, probably half of January. Now, think of what's happening. We've got consumers, they didn't need air conditioning, but they didn't have power. We had Silicon Valley and guys that were making manufacturing were in danger of power getting shut off. We had traffic lights going out. We had hospitals losing their power. Great demand for backup, for generators. We had to have an official rotational schedule so that people knew when their power was going to go out. And I will tell you that California was on pins and needles. I mean, warranted a front page article in Time that I provided you. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody could generate power until the federal government said, legally, you will generate power. But you only have to sell it to a creditable entity. San Diego remained a creditable entity. PG&E was not. As it turned out, they declared bankruptcy in April of 2001. SoCal Edison wasn't paying their bills either. They were not deemed creditworthy. The only creditworthy entity left in the state was the state. And the state of California swallowed very, very hard. The Governor Gray Davis, who had said, I could solve this energy problem in a moment if I was willing to raise prices, first he put $100 million in, then he put $1 billion in, and by the time we reached April, he had put $40 billion in. And they signed long-term contracts. The long-term contracts that the IOUs wanted to sign for the last 3 years were signed in the first quarter of 2001. And guess what? The price was 2 to 3 times what it would have been the year before. So for the $40 billion they put in, they got about $8 or $9 billion worth of power. It was hell. PG&E went bankrupt. SoCal Edison went bankrupt. No, SoCal Edison did not. They managed to stay, to avoid declaring bankruptcy, but they were basically totally illiquid. San Diego kept their head above because they were able to raise their rates. The other guys still weren't able to raise their rates. And it wasn't until the state started signing the contracts that the others could raise rates to cover the state's contracts. So it was that start of allowing PG&E and SoCal Edison to raise their rates to cover, because the state allowed it, the state is now on the hook for the power, that enabled us to get back to some level of normalcy. Fortunately, rain started coming in. Hydro up in the north was restored. And we didn't have 106 degrees in California or in San Francisco anymore. And by the time we got to summer, we could see recovery. We had bankruptcy. The CalPX, the company that was formed to clear the power, they went bankrupt. Calpine, one of the generators, went bankrupt. We at the Cal ISO stayed alive, though in that $1.6 billion I indicated that we billed for power in January, when we got the money in April, we were getting 10 cents on the dollar. By the time we reached July of 2001, we had more than $6 billion of power unpaid for. And the companies who were supplying it were having their problems too. They weren't getting the money. But fortunately, with the state getting in and putting its credit there, there was enough money to keep the generators going. But it was an unbelievably tenuous situation. It was not until September of 2001 that we were able to get back to where the power we delivered in that month was paid for 100 cents on the dollar. Now, Cal ISO, remember I said we got 10 cents out of the dollar. We had a first call on our expenses, which was very fortunate. Our expenses ran about $20 million a month. So at $1.6 billion, we got $160 million. We took the first $20 million and paid everybody else in 8 cent dollars. They did not appreciate that. But we were able to keep doing it until the system started to balance itself. And the reason we were able to keep doing it was there were two companies that continued to pay their bills. One was San Diego Gas and Electric. Do you know who the other participant in the market was that always paid their bills? There's a company in Houston. Enron. Why did Enron pay their bills? They were making so damn much money out of this that they couldn't afford to let the system go under. What we found out with a mysterious memo that was released by Enron, or released by somebody who worked for Enron in February, March of 2001. It had, here are the 7 tricks that Enron is pulling, or games that Enron is playing. And they were gaming the market. Several of the things they were doing were just gaming, and they were legitimate, but they found holes in the market. Several were unethical, and several were illegal. But of course, they never admitted to anything. They skipped out before we were able to get back at them. But it was an unbelievable environment. By the time we reached September, October of 2001, things were balancing and working. But stop and think of the risk. It wasn't the risk, just risk to me as an employee. Risk, it wasn't just risk that the IOUs faced. It wasn't risk that the investors in the generation plants faced. It wasn't just the risk that the politicians faced. Everybody in the state was exposed. Manufacturing companies never knew when power was going to get shut off. There were Silicon Valley companies that made chips that lost whole chips had to have electricity on an ongoing basis. And it was almost impossible for them to have generators that could stand by to make up for the power they were using. So that became impossible. People in hospitals, they had generators and they wouldn't get cut off, but if they didn't get cut off, somebody else got cut off. It was just an unbelievable challenge. And when I retired in April of 2008, things have been working smoothly for the last 7 years. But we still had not fixed our operating model. And it didn't get the operating model fixed until 2009. So everybody was on good behavior, not playing games. And I will tell you, as of October, the $6 billion that had been paid. By 2008, there was still $3 or $4 billion that still had to be paid. So it was an unbelievable environment. But we survived it. We learned from it. We saw risk like you couldn't believe. Risk number 1, model risk. We had a bad model. We had unethical participants. We had poor governance. Oh, yeah, we had 106 in California, in San Francisco. We had rain shortages. But again, the biggest problem we had were people. The biggest problem in the state of California were the servants, people in California. An old joke we used to do way back when, I think I first heard it at USAA, I may have heard it before that. It was a comic strip called Pogo. And Pogo was a captain of a little ship. And his final conclusion in one of those comic strips was, "We have met the enemy, and it is us." And that's what it was in California. Ego kept people from designing an effective system. Ego kept people from correcting the system when it could have been, risk could have been minimized. So people created the vast majority of the problem. People could have solved it. It didn't. We learned from it. We learned tremendous things. There's another saying, and I don't know who's responsible for it. Why do we study history? People who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. Well, we have to look at those mistakes we made and learn and say, what do we do better to keep it from happening again? But the risk to California, the risk to the whole western grid, California was really part of all power supply west of the Rocky Mountains. It scared the heck out of the two other grids in the country. The eastern grid, which basically went from Denver east all the way to Washington, D.C., New York, Maine, and Florida, all interconnected. You know what the other grid is? We have the eastern grid and the western grid. You know, what's the other grid? The third grid in the state in the United States. There's three grids that are independent. Eastern grid from Denver west. Excuse me, western grid. The eastern grid from Denver east. You know what the other independent grid is? State of Texas. State of Texas is not under federal regulation in its electric transmission because there is no interstate commerce in transmission. There's only in two minor places does power go outside the state. So Texas is independent of federal regulation. It also doesn't get power from outside the state. It generates all its power inside the state, which gives it both security and risk. And I don't know that ERCOT, which manages it, has yet figured out how to best manage that. Nobody's raised their hand and asked any questions at all. Is that because I bored people? Let me run back. One of the things I wanted to say, I talked about all the participants. I've talked about how we finally did survive. We talked about, there have been places, there was one in 2005 where the transmission system from eastern Ontario all the way to Maine basically was shorted out. It took weeks to get it re-going. It all started with one tree falling into a power line, and then the dominoes went. But it wasn't a problem. People discovered, hey, there are problems. Everybody had to go back and find out what those problems are. So transmission is a tremendous risk. And the FERC actually just ordered a study on March 7th. Everybody remember the PG&E substations? Their generators getting fired on, and somebody's got $6 or $7 million of damage to these generators, but it would take 6 months to replace them. The exposure of our transmission system to risk, to guns, to what do you call it? What's the word? The Taliban, not the Taliban, but the terrorists is unbelievable. Somebody can shut the whole system out just like that. So there's a risk there that's tremendous. But a couple points I want to make. One of the keys as you go forward in risk management is that you have to first have a plan. Why do you have to have a plan in order to have risk management? If you have a plan, you have goals. We're going to increase our stock price, we're going to increase our marketing, we're going to increase our sales, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then you're going to have strategies to implement to achieve those goals. But the key of risk management is to say, ask the question and find out the answer. Risk to what? If you don't have a goal, there's no risk. You've got to be able to define the risk, whether it's risk to expanding it, it's going to impact our stock price, it's going to impact our employees, our ability to hire. You've got to have goals. So in order to